Hi, my name is Ryan Langwish, and this is Ludolodge, a channel about sparking growth in your journey as a game designer. And one of the best ways to grow as a game designer, in my opinion, is to play designs by other designers, to play games and learn from what other designers are doing creatively in the medium. And that's why today I'm going to be talking through my top 5 games that inspired me most as a game designer in 2020. I played about 30 new to me games in 2020, mostly board games and a few video games. And I went through them and just tried to think which are the ones that really kind of got me the most excited about game design. The things that, whether it was specific mechanisms or just how it all came together in a package, got me excited about what I might be doing with my own game design projects, or simply like I admired what is done in the game and it got me excited about game design. And so this list is different than if I was making my top 5 board games of the year as a player, if I was just picking my favorites. That often is not quite the same as the ones that I find most intriguing in the designs, which I think is worth mentioning just so you know kind of the angle that I approach this list. I've done this for a few years now as a blog post and last year as a video. And it's a fun process for me to kind of go through and think about it. It's a good way to reflect on games I've played and kind of just try to nail down what it is about some of these designs that just clicked with me and got me excited about what they were doing. So without further ado, let's start off with number 5, which is Underwater Cities. Underwater Cities is a strategic game about building up your own underwater civilization, including domed cities, tunnels, and all kinds of aquatic technology. And while a lot of it kind of feels like standard kind of Euro game fare with a lot of the mechanisms are things we've seen before, the core central card mechanism is one that I found leads to a steady stream of interesting decisions throughout the game. In Underwater Cities, you always have a hand of 3 cards which come in 3 different colors. On your turn, you always will play one of those cards, but it will only activate if you also select an action of a matching color. You want to maximize your efficiency by always picking actions that will trigger your cards, but that often means that you need to consider actions that may have not been your first choice. It takes the decisions of a worker placement game and makes the value of the action spaces more dynamic as they are modified by what combinations those spaces can make with the cards in your hand. I also like that you have so few cards, as it really restricts the decision space in a good way. You often will be missing 1 or 2 colors, and it really affects how you approach the round. Or you might have a situation where you have 2 of one color and 1 of another. But do you play the color you only have 1 of and risk getting stuck with 3 of the same color? Or maybe I'm really interested in a green action, but I don't currently have a green card. Is it worth me stalling doing other things so that maybe I draw a green card that I can pair with that action? The single card that you draw at the end of your turn to replenish your hand can completely change your plans, as its color and effect may significantly shift the valuation of the action spaces. What inspires me about all of this is that it's such an arbitrary mechanic, one that really doesn't have any thematic justification, and yet it single-handedly creates the majority of the interesting decisions in the game. It is a mechanics first kind of design decision that I feel really opens up an interesting space for the players to explore. At number 4, we have Tiny Towns, a miniature town building game where each player's decisions on their turn affects all the other players in the game. Each player has a grid where they will be attempting to place resources in specific patterns to construct buildings that each have their own effects. Whenever a pattern is achieved, it condenses into a single space where that building is placed, opening up space on your board for other patterns to develop. But the way you play those resources is what is most interesting. If it is your turn, you get to pick any resource you want to place, but every other player must also place that resource. Conversely, on every other player's turn, you are going to be forced to play a resource that you may or may not have been interested in. Tiny Town certainly isn't the first game to keep players engaged on every player's turn, and it is definitely a style of play that is popularized in roll and write games where players are all repeatedly making simultaneous decisions based on some randomized element. But Tiny Towns feels closer to a standard family weight board game as opposed to players filling out a sheet with no interaction, and simply takes advantage of simultaneous play to really kill 3 birds with 1 stone. It keeps players engaged the entire game, it creates interesting decisions as players react to other players' choices, and it allows the game to elegantly scale up to 6 players, which is rarely done well in games of its strategic weight. As a designer, I think games like Tiny Towns have challenged me to really question any downtime that I am baking into my designs. It is easy to default into the players go around taking turns, taking actions structure, but I find myself asking, do the other players really need to just be waiting during other players' turns? Is there something I can add that'll keep them more engaged? Not only can this open my mind to solutions that keep players engaged, but can also help to combat playing time as you parallelize the decision making among the players. While there are many games that exemplify this, I think this kind of simultaneous play is in an area that is still ripe for exploration by designers. Number 3 is a game from 2007, which is practically ancient in modern board gaming terms, and that is Biblios, which is a small little card game where players are collecting cards of 5 different colors, ultimately with the goal of trying to have the highest total in any single color at the end of the game. The players with the highest total in that color are going to get to take the matching die of that color and score points equal to the value of that die, which may have changed throughout the game. There aren't very many points up for grabs, and there's no benefit to coming in second in a color. Only placing first will net you any points. But what I find most interesting about Biblios is how it is played over 2 distinct phases and how the mechanics of those phases combine with imperfect information to add a lot of interest and intrigue into what is otherwise a simple set collection game. In the first gift phase, players take turns drawing a number of cards equal to the number of players plus 1, and allocating those cards to different locations. 1 card the player gets to keep for themselves, 1 they get to place into an auction pile that'll be used in phase 2, and the rest of the cards are set aside for their opponents to draft in turn order. Now, drawing a hand of cards and choosing where to place them would be interesting in and of itself, but my favorite design decision in Biblios is that the active player only gets to see 1 card at a time and must make a decision without knowing what other cards they might draw next. If I draw a card that is pretty good, do I keep it for myself? Or do I push my luck and hope that I draw an even better one? But if I keep a card early and also send a card to the auction, I'm completely at the mercy of the deck with what cards will be available to my opponents. How painful will it be to see an amazing card come up later that I have no choice but to send away? It is just such a fun process, and it keeps the other players interested in what cards might be available to them, while also obscuring information as the card that you keep, as well as put in the auction pile, are not revealed to other players. The second phase is kind of a standard auction, as cards in the auction pile get offered up 1 at a time, but it is interesting as the money that is used for the auction is specific cards that were gained during the first gift phase. So do I pick high gold cards during the gift phase so that I have more buying power even though I don't know exactly what cards will be up for auction? And which colors do I end up pursuing since I only want to invest resources in categories I could legitimately win? It all comes together as a very elegant and interesting filler, and I find it inspiring how a couple of really simple design decisions end up eliciting such a range of player emotions throughout what is really a pretty short game. My number 2 game that inspired me the most as a game designer in 2020 is a much heavier and more strategic game than the last entry, and that is Brass Birmingham. While some of my favorite strategy games start to trend towards more of a multiplayer solitaire kind of setup where players are really mostly working on their own board with minimal interaction, I have a lot of appreciation for games that manage to really have rich player interaction in a very organic way where one player's decision suddenly can kind of shift the tactical landscape for all of the other players involved. And Brass Birmingham is a game that has this in spades. The combination of route building and economic supply and demand is simply a foundation that is ripe for interesting and evolving board states. Brass works this foundation to perfection as players expand their networks and opportunistically look for ways to introduce resources into the system that can get gobbled up by other entities. With each decision, the valuations of the market shift and new opportunities emerge. I may be strategically executing my plan to build up and use my own resources, but suddenly demand for coal has gone up as other players' purchases have led to scarcity. This leads to exciting reactive plays where I might abandon my plans and build a coal mine simply to immediately meet the demands of the market. The simplicity but effectiveness of the interconnected mechanisms has me smiling as I see yet another clever play that is materialized out of the industrial ecosystem. On top of all of that, I also love the concept of a game that plays over multiple eras, with remnants of previous eras setting the stage for what comes next. As Brass moves from the Canal era to the Railroad era, the board mostly clears, but leaves behind a scattering of industries that are essentially a variable setup for the Rails era, but a variable setup that is rooted in the history of the player's actions in the previous era. It gives the game a very different arc of player experience, and I think that method of manipulating game pacing is underutilized in designs. All of this strategy is paired with the puzzle of players working from a randomized hand of options, not all that unlike the cards in Underwater Cities, providing the building blocks for a strategy that is forced to adapt with each new card draw. I've only played Brass Birmingham a couple of times, but both the player and the designer in me are eager to explore it further. And finally, my number one game that inspired me the most in 2020, and it may be a little bit of a surprise after hearing some of the entries on this list, but I have to give it to The Crew, The Quest for Planet 9. In this small, simple card game, the designers simply asked the question, what if a traditional trick-taking game, like Hearts or Spades, was made to be cooperative? And they follow that thought experiment and see where it leads them, and that the result has taken the modern board gaming industry by storm. Just hearing the basic concept doesn't sound particularly compelling. Okay, so we are playing a trick-taking game, and you have to take the blue 7, and I have to take the green 3. But the way the concept plays out with players limited to a single restricted communication is just a perfect combination of both deduction and teamwork. Additionally, it ends up doing a few things that I have not seen often in modern games. First, each hand is an independent mission that is won or lost, and players work through a campaign of missions, playing as many as they want during each session. Campaign elements in modern games tend to be associated with big dungeon crawls, so I find it very interesting to see it implemented in a short little game that is very easy to play many times in a row, which segues into the next aspect I don't see very often, which is the flexibility of game session length. The end of every mission in The Crew is a potential stopping point for the group's session, which makes it easy to pull out as a quick 20-minute game, but you can also play it for 2 hours or more straight. I have often played it to finish off a game night, as it makes it so easy to make sure that we call it a night when the time comes. It's a little thing, but I also realized that I couldn't really think of many other games that provide so many natural opportunities to sort of get off the ride and still feel like it's a satisfying conclusion. It's not a feature I think of much as a designer, but I think it's one that designers should probably consider more often. But more than anything, I think what inspires me the most about The Crew is that as one of the hottest games of 2020, it is such a simple concept. Like cooperative trick-taking, why didn't I think of that? I think it is easy for designers to think that innovation needs to be complex, but The Crew proves that one simple connection can open a door to a design space that is just previously unexplored. I'm reminded of video game designer Jonathan Blow talking about his game Braid, and how once he came up with the initial time manipulation mechanic, it felt like he was just digging and uncovering all kinds of gold nuggets of where to go next in the design, without even having to work at it. He was just finding it. I feel like The Crew may have followed a similar pattern. As the initial concept proved to be interesting at the most basic level, the designer was able to just keep exploring down that path of variations and uncover new nuggets of experience in this design space that was completely uncharted. And I find that possibility of finding those kinds of things very, very exciting. And there you have it. Those are the 5 that rose to the top out of the roughly 30 new games that I played in 2020. Hopefully I was able to capture kind of why they inspired me in a way that was interesting and maybe sparked things for you. And that's really, I put it in the slogan of Ludo Lodge, right? That it's sparking growth for game designers. And that's really the idea, is hearing things like this. I've found when I listen to podcasts or anything kind of game design related, it just gets the wheels spinning and gets me excited about working on designs. So I hope maybe that this video did that for you. If you enjoyed it, consider giving it a like, consider subscribing to the channel for more content for game designers, and I will see you in the next video.